Welcome to the Stoa. The Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere and dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now.
Okay, thank you for attending yet another Psychotechnology Playground with Bonnitta Roy at the Stoa. The Stoa is a place for dialogue around what matters most at the knife edge of the times. So, I was thinking of...
I'm just going to jump in, not because your introduction wasn't good, but because there's seems like there's feedback on your mic or something.
Oh, weird. Is this better? No?
Are other people hearing it too? Like maybe get a, yes, other people are hearing it as well.
Microphones. Oh, okay, that's why. Is that better?
Yes, that's much better.
Okay, the microphone setting was off. Okay. Wow, that was probably the case in this conference I was just on and nobody complained. They'd be like, okay, so welcome to the Psychotechnology Playground with Bonnitta Roy at the Stoa. The Stoa is a place to meet in dialogue around what matters most at the knife edge of history. And you are here on the knife edge. Okay, so I was thinking this morning about like, what is the Psychotechnology Playground? And so I wanted to try to dive a little deeper into that territory. You know, we got started by doing those source code protocols. That was a little more like cognitive and conceptual, but can we dive in from there, going to kind of a deeper regions of mind? This is always a challenge because I'm kind of revising what I do in the research, the Insight Center here for kind of a short Zoom application. So there's always a very experimental aspect to it. And I think that the other sessions have been lovely and your participation has been great. So now I'm going to try to take on another challenge. So we're going to do a series about unpacking the nature of experience. And you know, some of you have probably done a lot of work in meditation. You may belong to a tradition. So I don't mean to undermine the more sophisticated work you're doing, but what I'm intending to do is to see if we can accelerate a shared understanding of some of these sophisticated wisdom skills. So in many traditions, I'm thinking here of modern meditation trainers like Shinzen Young, Daniel Ingram, Kenneth Folk. Some of you might know some of these words. They create a labeling system that's going to sound dualistic. The point is to start as if these are separate things, just so we can parse the territory, but eventually we reclaim them and we integrate them. So Kenneth Folk, for example, will say everything is either experience or thought. Okay, so we're just going to use this framework. I know it sounds hopelessly dualistic, but it does come from these traditions. And what we want to do is see how accurately and precisely we can talk about them in a shared language that's not hopelessly confounded by all these spiritual terms and these split hairs and these nuances in Buddhist scholastics and cognitive neuroscience. Okay, so this is part of a modern minimalist approach to unpacking the nature of experience. So we're just going to have these two placeholders. They should work as placeholders for now. We have thought and we have experience. And today we're just going to work with thought, and we're going to work with the most ordinary and in some sense irritating or distracting mode of thought, and that's called inner talk or inner speech. right? It's when we are going on an interview and we rehearse, we rehearse what we're going to say, right? We have the whole conversation. Oh, no, then you rehearse it and you rehearse it and you rehearse it. So inner speech is any kind of thought that actually is like virtualized talk. So before we go on, does everybody does everybody grok what we're talking about? What kind of ordinary human experience we're talking about? Okay, now imagine you met your space traveler and you met a intelligent species that could speak to you, like maybe you have transponders so you can speak, but they don't have inner talk. Okay, the two placeholders are thought and experience. And today we're looking only at thought. That was a question from the chat. And the part of thought we're looking at is just this thing called inner talk. Okay, so we're going to start examining this. Okay, so you meet an alien and they talk to each other, like they make sounds in their air, but they don't have inner talk. And the alien says, "What is that?" How would you explain what is happening when you have inner talk? So the alien might say, "Do you mean you hear something?" And you would have to hedge. "Well, I don't actually hear it like I'm hearing you now." So this is what I'm asking you. What is actually happening? I mean, this is so familiar to you, right? It's like the most ordinary thing, and actually sometimes it's like when you have a song in your head, it's very similar, right? You hear a song in your head, and the alien's like, "What do you mean? You hear a song in your head? Like, do you hear it?" Well, if you actually heard it, that would be either real perception or oral hallucination. But we're talking about this other thing that seems to be enclosed in your thought. So what kinds of things would you say? Yeah, so someone said imagining it, but then you have to describe what is imagination. So what is this thing that is happening when you're doing this? I mean, you're thinking of recipes, you're thinking you make lists in your head, you've got like schedules, and then you go, no, but if you, God forbid, you're planning a wedding. A lot of that is going on in your head. What is that? And isn't it strange that we don't know what that is? So yeah, someone says, okay, this is good. Someone's splitting into two persons, one talking to another, talking to oneself. But how does the talking happen? Do you move your mouth? Do you make sounds? So this is a good first move. You understand there's a split perspective of a listener and a talker, all right? So you've kind of created a spatial, George Herbert Mead made this point, that you're actually playing two roles, okay? So when you're listening to the talk in your head, which one are you? The talker or the listener? Or do you toggle back and forth? So that's one part of it, this ability to hold both perspectives while this inner talk is happening. But how does inner talk happen? There's a thought that comes from a neurological pathway. Okay. Yes, that is one way to start getting at it. Is that neurological pathway intentional then, for example? How do you take over the intentionality of thinking out things? Previously burned by past experience. Tanya is saying this. Yes, what's this notion of previously burned? it only feels split if I'm aware of it in a way that feels separate. There's also a way to be aware of it. Okay, yes. So there is, you can be completely unaware of the neuropathological processing of thought, or you can be you can have both perspectives, and you could be like, sometimes if I'm writing something, I'm too lazy to get out of bed, I actually start, well, maybe the title should be this, you know, I'm actually very intentionally manipulating the symbolic words in my head. So this notion of what identity you are, or how many identities, is very important. So how does it, okay, yes, so this notion of burning, like burning a CD, right, is very good. Now, where does the burning come from? You're going to get into an infinite regress if you say it comes from earlier thoughts, right? What is that which burns? Attention, emotion, yes, but that's true if you're recreating emotion, but we're talking about inner talk. The words, the speaker in your head. Ah, okay. Who said that? Experience itself. Does Brandon, do you want to unpack that a little?
Sure. So the weight of an experience, I guess, imprints the neural pathway that Tanya was talking about. And then, so when you have a similar experience in the future, there's like a resonance from that first experience that echoes, I guess, it's echo, and that's the voice, is that echo of that first experience bouncing off the rock that's now appearing before you, that's similar to the rock that it came from.
Okay, so what would the first experience of inner talk be like?
Nothing's coming up for me immediately.
Okay, good. You moved the needle. Tanya, do you want to follow the rabbit hole?
Yeah, sure. I was feeling into an experience back in my childhood in elementary school of where I feel like I was developing a sense of self or identity. Someone said identity. And there was a context that I was existing in that had ideas about that. And I also had an experience that wasn't necessarily connected to that construction, or not a product of that construction, but it was interpreted through that construction, and a story formed about who I was and how the world is. And then that story replicated itself over and over and over the years in different ways, in different situations, and burned in a neurological pathway or pathways.
Yeah, so that's a great explanation of the burning in. And I like this. This is a good metaphor for sussing this out. But we're trying to not we're trying to be very simple, which makes it more difficult. Okay. How does the ability to talk to yourself get burned in? Well, through experience. But what kind of experience? Just the ability to talk to yourself, not the whole experience itself. It's actually very, very simple, which is why you can't see it. Try to think the source protocol. Try to think very, very simply.
There's a way in which it's happening right now, I feel like, in relation to you and the there are ideas of looking for the right answer that are creating static.
So I'm going to ask you, I'm going to give you a clue. Now, sometimes these clues put you off in the wrong direction. It's not what I'm offering it for, but if it goes south, I'll just say, forget that clue, okay? Okay. So Brandon, I think you're onto it, but I want to give the clue for other people. Very good work. See, I think you were onto it before, but you needed your quiet time, right? To like get to it. So I want you to virtualize moving your right hand, raising your right hand. Don't raise it, just virtualize it in your mind, right? So that's a thought. What is the fundamental first experience of raising your right hand? That's not a thought. That burns that into your mind. This is should be an easy question. The first experience of raising your hand, yes. You raise your hand, you burn in the ability to reimagine it. So when you first learn to raise your hand, your sensory motor practice process is coming from your core intentional space, activates some motor neurons, you do this with your hand. That pathway is now accessible for downward causation, which means you can think of raising your hand. So this notion of burning is perfect. Now here's the thing about thought. All thought is the burning of your mouth moving, and your ears know when your mouth moves like this and your tongue, that's what it sounds like. It's not some wavy, fancy, schmancy consciousness thing. It's the subtle recreation of the embodied experience of talking and hearing, burned in, and then downwardly caused. And this is why Google is creating sensors that can read your thoughts, because it can subtly feel the little trackings, very subtle movement, action patterns that are sub-threshold when you think inner talk. And that's what it is. That's what thought is. Does it make sense? People don't, especially spiritual people, they don't want to know this because they have a mind-body duality. They think thought is implanted from some kind of cosmic sphere. It's inherently dialogic in nature. It's a miracle that we can do it. It's a miracle that we can recreate raising your right hand in your mind, right? The fact that we can do that is why you can control an artificial limb with your mind. If you had never had arms, you could not control artificial limbs because those pathways, the downward causation, has not been burned into your brain. And it's not only your brain, many, many other things are involved. I just use brain as a placeholder. But inner talk is the same thing. Inner talk is the subtle recreation of sensory motor patterns in a downward causation. Okay, yes. So, but then how can I have an original thought that we never had before? So let me talk about downward causation first. So downward, it's a cybernetics term. So in terms of our burning, we mean like when we, I'm going to use vinyl records because I actually don't know how you make CDs, right? So when you're recording a record, first you have the vinyl and you're burning in the grooves, right? That's what we would call upward causation. Real experience is setting pathways. So the first time if I say water, 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 not only is what I'm getting is I'm getting a covariance between what my mouth is doing and what it sounds like. And so the perceptual sound, the perceptual organs of the ears are starting to covary with this water, water. Every time I do this water, water, my ears say that feeling of going water sounds like this. And these two things become coupled. That's why I can read people's lips, because I can see what's happening with their lips feels like this. And then my ears say that's always coupled with this sound. So you're wiring together different aspects of perception. This is why you can teach mute people to speak by touching, when they touch your face. Okay? So so those get wired together. So this feeling is associated with a sound. We haven't gotten to the meaning yet, symbolic meaning. We're just talking about the sound. And then what happens is, so that's upward causation. Now the downward causation is when I am thinking to say water in my head. You can do it now. If you go slow, water, and you're very, very aware, you can feel that you feel your mouth doing that. If you exaggerate it. And that slight motor, subtle motor pattern, your ears are so primed to say, well, that's what that sounds like. They add into the subthreshold motor movement a subthreshold sound. And that's called subvocalization. That's called inner talk. So that's what I mean by downward causation. It's not the action, the motor action and the perception causing an experience. It's activating the patterns that were burned in to cause the virtualization of an experience. Yes, so where does the thought arise from? We didn't get there yet. If you're gonna, and we're not going to do that today because we have to go to symbolic representation, then mental models, the structural architecture of mind, and then the fundamental organization of self, other, and world. So these are all aspects of thought. We already mentioned some of the self, other, and world, because we started by saying you can recreate like a conversation, two people, you recreate a dialogus in your brain. So that is an organization of self and other, a certain type of organization of self and other. You've organized that in your head. So we have to build up mind from these different aspects, and inner talk is actually not a very interesting part of mind. It doesn't give you a lot of insight. It uses language which is coarse-grained, right? Uses language which is coarse-grained. One of my first experiences was when I was 3 years old. And I know I was 3 years old because my mother was teaching me how to pray. And so I asked her, when did you teach me how to pray? And she said, oh, that's when your sister went to first grade. And so you were probably 3 years old. I used to stay home with you. And so I know it was, that's how I know it was when I was 3 years old. And, you know, we're Catholics, right? So you get on your knees by the side of the bed and you go like this. And you'd say words. And I thought, that is weird. Why would you use words to talk to God? Because words are very coarse. They seemed like such a crude instrument to, anyways. So, and then she said, and so I said what she said. And then she said, and God, I'm sorry that I was mean to my sister. And I went, wow, why would you lie to God? And I thought, okay, well, I thought maybe, I thought, well, my mom knows I'm little, and adults have this way of pretending with kids until they get older. So I just thought, well, this is what one day I would get older, and this kind of fake way of being would go away. And I remember when I was about 8 or 10 or at some point in my life, I realized that they didn't even know they were pretending, right? So this is how I started my life. But what I used to do after we would, pretend our prayers, I would lay down and I would have this practice that I would call swallowing the words, right? Because I could see, and I would try to talk to God, but swallow the words, because the words seemed like always little fault. They were always a little false. They always rang a little false. So I would swallow the words, and I'd get really familiar with how do words come in your head? Where do they come from? And you can find the energy of the proto word and the energy to articulate and stuff like that. So so these are discoveries that I've been making by paying attention for many, many years now. And so there's a lot of neuroscience around this. And really, this is why Google can make this face mask with sensors that can read your mind, because it transpons, it modulates backwards. There's very subtle subthreshold motor neurons in your speaking area and your tongue to do exactly what your brain is doing. It's translating these subthreshold motor actions or impulses into the expected perception of sound. Swallowing words, so years later, I learned that if you meditate and you want to slow down monkey mind, thoughts in your head, there's a way, that you can, there's a controlled breathing exercise. And so basically this was what I was doing was very similar to these tantric practices. So when the words start to form, you take a really deep breath and you pay attention to the really deep breath, and then the energy that was going to become a word goes away. So I called them swallowing your words, because it had to do with these. And you could get hypertrophic breathing, and anyways, it was just what I would play around with, and I called it swallowing your words. It wasn't sophisticated, but it's very similar to some sophisticated techniques you see in meditation. So let's unmute ourselves and try to have some conversation. This was, around inner talk.
A question for me is, where does, like if Google's trying to figure out where, what's it measuring? Is it measuring the thought? Is it measuring the muscles first? Which comes first, but not because that's so important, but where's this origination of the thought such that all this stuff can happen?
Yeah, so I'll try to answer your question, but first I'll make a distinction. We're only talking about inner speech right now, right? There's lots of more depth and thought. Okay, so it's AI.
Yeah.
So if you put sensors on a person mouth, and then you have the computer listening to the words it makes, the AI is doing the same thing your brain does. It's recognizing patterns are associated with predictable sounds, right? So you just keep running AI over and over and over again until it realizes that these patterns make those sounds. So then when you put right, so then if I put this on and I'm thinking words in my mind, there's subtle motor neuron patterns happening that the AI picks up, and then the system will make those sounds for you, right?
Yeah,
So,
and what I'm trying to get to is what comes first? I mean, where does this originate from when you have a sudden thought? And some people are talking about, imagination or original ideas. The impulse for this to just appear, or, I mean, it feels like it's really patterned history, what I've known before, with, only maybe a slight bit of something new. But where does that come from that isn't about just the history and what I already recognize and my previous thoughts and my understanding of how my thoughts work?
yeah, so some of it is habits, right? Some of it is the energy comes up, and so it'll come up into we have to make distinctions. So there's many different places it can come. So for example, if there's an external trigger that is associated with some kind of emotions, people said this, right? That you've wrapped inside a story, then when you see somebody, you might say, oh my God, that in your mind, it might result into mental talk. Where does it come from? When you bump into a friend on the street, where does all that bullshit come from? Oh, nice day, isn't it? Blah, 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 blah. Where does that come from, right? When we have a certain type of culture where nervous energy is discharged as speech. This is our culture. The indigenous people, they sit for hours and they'll say, second cloud, But for us, social energy, we're our energy has to go somewhere. It has to be discharged. And for us, it's discharged as speech. And when there's no one around, we discharge it as loopy speech in our own head. This is what we do because we don't know what else to do with our energy. We have a lot of nervous energy, and this is where it goes. So that's where the impulse, one of the first impulses of inner speech comes to. If we're preparing a presentation or going to an interview, we're not able to be confident that when the interviewer asks me a question, I just answer. The anxiety creates inner speech, and then we prepare, we practice, and we go through words. So that's one level. The energy discharges as inner speech. If you have dementia, you actually start talking. You know, you walk around and you actually start talking. It doesn't stay sub-threshold. You murmur and talk to yourself. If you have certain types of Tourette syndrome, it doesn't stay sub-threshold. Okay, so that's one way. It's energy discharging. That's who we are as a culture. Most Western cultures are like that. It's why we're on Zoom 24/7 when we're home, because we have all this energy and we just discharge it as speech. This is how we are as humans. And so when we're alone, we discharge it as speech in our head. In many cases, it's, if you start paying attention, when you start to meditate, your human condition drives you crazy because it's the same fucking thing over and over and over again. Your mother, your partner, your mother, your partner, your mother, your kids, your partner, your mother, your kids, right? So it doesn't have, it just uses those patterns that it knows to discharge all the time. It doesn't go anywhere. So that's one thing. That's that, and we're talking about inner talk. Okay, so that's one thing. Inner talk can be helpful if you're a speechwriter. And instead of, writing down and editing, you could lay down and you could actually go over the inflection or something in it, so you can use it. Simulating experience is helpful because you can run a lot more experiments without using up so much energy. So Nikola Tesla, for example, said that he would test his instruments, he would test his inventions in his head before he actually built them, right? So the ability to simulate experience can be very helpful. It could be a shorthand. So that's one thing. Then there is, so for example, beneath inner talk is symbolic representation. So that's the meaning of the words. And beneath that are mental models or stories. So we're always trying to organize our experience. In many cases, people get beyond this, but in general, we organize our stories, our experience in terms of stories. And so even if you're not hearing your mental talk, you have certain stories, like you're the victim, or you're, the victim of patriarchy, or you're the oppressor, or you're privileged, or you're oppressed, or you're so-and-so who's on a career path, or, we constantly are organizing experience in these mental models of self, other, and world, and where we're at in our history. This is called autobiographical coherence. Most people want autobiographical coherence. Once you start to actually be honest with yourself, you see it's just you're connecting the dots backwards to make sense of your world. And in fact, a person's life doesn't make any sense. You're here for all kinds of reasons, and there's no linear reason. But in general, what's very important to people from a psychic structure is autobiographical coherence. So this is why it's hard for us to live in the time of COVID, because we want to know, how does this fit in this nice little linear explanation, right? So when we're disrupted, when our autobiographical coherence is disruptive, we retroactively recreate the story, and we often do that in our heads. So we'll catch ourselves thinking that so-and-so would never betray me, okay? She's my best friend, she would never betray you. And then something happens, and then you say, she wouldn't have betrayed me if her life wasn't so sad. Now you've extended the story, so it still makes sense of the story you have. And sometimes that process, you do it by talking to yourself as your own best friend. You say, why did she do that? Why did she be? And until you settle on another version of the story, and then you live in that story. So that's another way another time we use internal talk. Yeah, how do you have agency in relationship to this mechanism is a really good question. And one of the things about all of these, about downward causation, is you want to have choice. You don't want these scripts to be running every time the energy comes up, an old script to be running, because the world has changed, right? The problem with thought is that it relies on downward causation. It relies on something being burned in and then replayed. So it's always behind the impermanence of the world. It's always in the past, right? Only the upward causation is an authentic response to the immediate present. It's always in the past. Now, we don't, it's also fun to preserve memories and to create stories and to have shared, use these imaginatively in social space. If you've lived with someone for a long time, like me, I've been with my partner for like 32 years. People come over, they say, oh, tell us, how do you first met? And there's always there's a common thread, but it always gets embellished with, it's no longer really, when we even laugh about it afterwards, it's like, yeah, that's not really true anymore to the facts. All these things about your other life and what you've grown to know about each other start getting embellished into the story of how we first met. And now we can't even remember it anymore. And so this is downward causation, but this is a fun thing. It's not a bad thing, but you have agency and imaginative, and it's kind of a work of art in the moment. So one of the things you might be working with, one of the things to work toward, and maybe Kim, this is helpful to you. I know you're stuck on something you want to figure out, is that as you're listening here and you're trying to figure this out, which is a good thing, you want to go further, we'll go further. It's not necessary to turn the energy of curiosity into inner thought. The thinking process, the curiosity itself, can process itself without turning that into inner thought. That's the first step, because inner talk is too coarse an instrument to work out these very subtle questions of experience. And you actually live where, when you're like, wow, that's really interesting, you just still hunt the question. I know you took that course. You don't let the inner talk try to work on it, because it's way too coarse an instrument. It's not only too coarse an instrument, it's like when I was 3 years old, it's like, why do you use words? But it only has phrases for what's happened to you in the past, because it's a downward causation. So this is why you don't want to use the words and the phrase and the thinking process for discovering something new. You want to feel the energy of that curiosity, and I'm going to use this term for Kim because she took the course, to still hunt it. You can feel it processing there. And try, and then, you might take a look and use some words, and then you'll feel, like you said, it just goes around and around and around. I can't get out. And then you stop, because you haven't worked it out yet. Now, this is also very scientifically valid. So I discovered this in college. When I was taking physics, I had skipped some math courses that I really should have taken. I had advanced placement, but I really should have taken them, because when it came to do physics, I didn't have enough really understanding of the math. Like I could answer the questions and get advanced placement, but I was handicapped because I didn't really have a good enough understanding of the math. And I would be in college. This was before computers, you know, this is a long time ago. And I'd be like working on this problem and this book, and I would fall asleep in the we call them cubicles, these little stations. And, you know, it'd be like 2 o'clock in the morning, I'd wake up and I'd be like, oh my God. And then I'd be like, oh, I know the answer to that. In my sleep, the problem was still working. So I started thinking this was really interesting. So then I started going like, well, how long do I work? What if I only work for 45 minutes on the problem and go back to my room, take a nap? I started calling these my elves, okay? And took me years to find neuroscience, or for neuroscience to discover exactly what's happening here. And so you start to then go from inner talk to the felt sense. You can really feel the sense that where and how your body is working on a problem, and you don't have to pay attention. It's like it's gifted for free. And this is actually the way the child grows. The child doesn't work out how to speak. It's gifted this for free. The child doesn't, you know, and this is how upward causation works. It comes from the inheritance of being a human, and you gifted it for free. This is the abundance of the awakened mind and the paucity of the monkey mind. Yeah. So, boy, we went through this one fast. I should have slowed down and taken more time. But I hope you can see how this is you know, and I hope you can play with it. Are there any other questions? And we're just really here today. If we, between today and next week, if you can really just pay attention to words in your head, sentences in your head, and maybe if you really pay attention to them, again, we're creating a metacognitive ability to watch the words in your head. Then you can start to pay attention to just before there are words in your head, you might get some tension here sometimes. Sometimes you might feel it here. You'll start to feel what it feels like in your body just before the energy turns into words in your head. When you do that, you can work at them there, at that junction, where people have done this experiment here, and sometimes people go, oh, I get them at the proto-thought level now, okay? Then you're working with just before the energy turns into words, it's proto-words, and then that's a deeper processing, and then you can start to be actually physically aware of the sensation of this subtle processing, in which if you try to pay attention, you're just in the way. And then what happens is you start to do insight practice, the subtle processing, you know, and you go for a walk, you do this, I go down to the barn and I clean up poop. And then all of a sudden, when it's ready, it's like, boom, wow, that's what Whitehead was saying. Oh my God, wow, that's what Whitehead was saying. And you start to live from, transition from monkey mind to insight practice, insight mind, generative mind. This is what we're trying to teach for collective insight practice. Is there a causal link between upward causation and Wu Wei? Yes, Taoist not doing is this sense of the point at which the habits are not habitual, but they're generative. you feel like you're doing nothing because you're constantly receiving what the body does. Now, you're not going to have an insight. You're not going to have an insight. Wow, that's what Whitehead was saying. If you didn't do your homework and read Whitehead and give yourself a lot of tools to process with. But once you've done that, you can really, you can, like I'm doing now, I can think and think, I can feel it processing here. And you are free to, you need to relax, and you're free to go on walks or enjoy nature or do chores. And then all of a sudden, you'll see something, or your attention will go somewhere, and then the whole insight comes. Yeah, so Ron, I don't know if you know me, I'm a big critic of hierarchical complexity theory, developmental hierarchical complexity, because it tends to measure linguistic symbolic complexity. And so they call that the vertical dimension. So I call this the depth dimension. And it's a different kind of complexity. It's the complexity of the primitive mind. The primitive mind is more complex, and, more primitive, but more complex than the modern mind. And part of this is a bias in our culture toward what is later is always advanced or progressive. It's very hard for us to do a timeline and see what's on the far end of the timeline as regressive. Ivan Illich, for example, predicted that all the innovations in modern life, education, he's the one that said, the schools make you stupid, the medicine makes you sick, and the money makes you poor. Because he said that all these advances, they level out. And so like medicine, he predicted that after a certain point, and he was writing in the 70s, I think, and he said that point is now, all the advances would harm you. They'd be all iatrogenic advances. And this has become very obvious in today's world. And so that all these innovations have peaks, and then you have to do something else, right? But because we keep pushing modern medicine into territories it's not complex enough to study, then after a certain point, all the innovations in modern medicine will be harmful. And all the things we teach will make you stupid, and all the financial instruments we create will make you poorer, because they have a terminus. But we, as moderners, we think everything in the future is in advance. So we keep trying to advance these tools that need to be completely rethought. So part of that is answering Ron's chat question. Yes, so people that really look at the hierarchical complexity in those models, in my opinion, are looking in the wrong direction. They certainly are true theories because they describe the modern mind, but I don't think they're describing the emergent mind, what we need. I think it's a dead end. And we see this, for example, in the fact that postmodern mind is more complex, higher up in the developmental hierarchical complexity, but it cannot act. It's frozen, right? It's not a very beneficial mind in many cases. It's very reactive and responsive and deconstructive. So that's part of the sense in which why I critique those models. Yeah, that was a good noticing there. And of course, all my friends are developmental psychologists, so I have to. I'm the thorn in their sides.
I'm Bonnitta. I'm reflecting on how this shows up in my everyday, and I've been doing this liminal space practice at night where I get rid of all my devices from my room and I go to sleep, and then I have all this insight in the morning when I'm waking up. And now I'm like, there's all these ways in which I've been trying to this fervent energy, like trying to pile on experience during the day, like how many of these Stoa sessions can I do, or how many conversations, and so that I can like keep, and how can I actually do this? Allow space to just let my mind do what it's designed to do over the course of the day as well, and have that liminal space practice then.
Yeah, sometimes there's rhythms to this, and as a Taoist, we say, and I think it's really true, Taoism is sometimes people think of Taoism as balance in the sense that, every day I need space and rest and this and that, but it's more like you expand your horizon and you see balance is achieved because sometimes for like 3 months you're crazy doing one thing, and then you have 3 months of something else, right? So the rhythm of this, they're not always diurnal, or, and you start to, this is something I had to do when I first left my job in my career in 2012, because we had a small office in a very big business. And, the work would just come and come. And I really was I very much enjoyed, like, just when I thought I couldn't take any more and someone would come in a new contract and get on the phone and get the trucks, and, it was really logistical planning and stuff. It was fun. We built beautiful gardens and stuff. But then all of a sudden I'm home and I don't have anything coming at me. And the structure, the organism was completely like lost, really. I would binge watch Mad Men at night, like for hours, because I needed that. I was like an addict to a certain type of pacing, and I knew that's why I was binge watching it, right? So and some of you know Rhea Beck. She said to me, a word of wisdom at the right timing. She said, you've spent your whole career cramming more into time. Why don't you try to follow the rhythm of time? No. Why don't you let time lead and figure out what fits it, or something like that. It was one of those things she said beautifully at the time, and it changed. And then I noticed that I have rhythms like that. And you can trust them, because sometimes you'd be like, I'm like a crazy person. In the spring, I'm like a crazy person with the gardens and stuff. But I also have been doing this long enough to know that I'll be a lazy person again in August. And then you start to then let the time shape you, rather you kind of instrumentalizing time all the time. So I wouldn't worry about it. And then neither worry about a time when you spend 2 weeks and you're lazy, and you'd be like, who is this person? And that's okay too. And then you start to understand, that's a really cool way of understanding this aspect of experience. So you turn time from a cognitive organizational principle, we'll talk about that, to you're experiencing time for the first time. And it'll be different for everyone and different for you at different times in your life. Yeah, so I don't know if that was helpful, but.
I'm just gonna jump in here before I forget
time's up.
the time. Yes, we're at the hour. And so I don't know if you know this, Bonnitta, but Rhea is embedded in the wisdom gym now. So she's coming in at 12 p.m. to do a collective presencing practice. So you're the warm-up act for her every Friday. It's a good 1-2 punch. So yeah, if people are interested in this group, you can just go on the stowawebsite.ca and RSVP for that. And I'll just hand it back to Bonnitta just to do any closing thoughts.
Yeah, so this was great. I hope it's the right amount of practice and exercise and talk. I always think I talk a little too much, but hopefully you can practice really exploring what inner talk is and try to find the root out of it. Yeah, so breakout groups would be nice. Maybe we could do that next time, Peter, so that there's more conversation and more meaning making, because we will be getting into it gets more and more subtle as we explore the nature of thought. And then if I'm still around, we'll explore the nature of experience, which is even more subtle.
Yeah, and if you
At a certain point, they blend. At a certain point, you'll see that at a certain point, thought, oh, is that thought or is that experience? And you notice that then there's a false dichotomy, as I started out with.
And I just thought if you need more time, like maybe 75 minutes or 90 minutes, we can do that if that works better for the upcoming sessions, if people have a stomach for it and they have availability for it.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is good, but just don't maybe schedule exactly at the hour, because then I don't want to run into other people's time.
Cool.
Okay, so there you go. This was hard work, and I hope you enjoyed it, and that is actually meaningful and relevant. And I'll see you next week. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bonnie. That's great.